Brooke, and I'm here with Susan P. Spannett, and this is part 3 of our series focusing on COVID and trauma. And today we're going to be talking about grief and how it relates, well, as being a part of COVID.
Yes.
So, hello.
Hi. It's a hard topic, grief, and I think we are not talking about it enough because a lot of times we think of grief as something that happens when it's over, right? But it's not over. We don't know when it's going to be over. I think I wanted to acknowledge that there are so many levels of loss that we have been experiencing through this time that feels traumatic to people, but they're not always acknowledged because it almost feels overwhelming to acknowledge it and add to the level of stress that we already have. But in good therapist form, paradoxically, often when we acknowledge the unspeakable, we do feel better. So I'm going to throw out some thoughts for you guys today about how grief and the trauma of COVID go hand in hand. And the more we can be with those feelings of grief and sadness and let them move through us, the more present we can be, and then also find our peace and our joy in the midst of all of that. Does that make sense?
Sure. There's a lot of information and you're going to be breaking it down, so
yeah. So I thought that we would kind of walk through, like we did in the last video, we talked about the sort of different levels of trauma that go along with COVID. There's also different levels of grief. So starting with the personal, obviously there are people out in the world that have lost loved ones to this terrible disease, and that's real. And right now, I think the statistics are about 1 in 500 people in the United States have died of COVID, which is a lot. That's a lot of
when you
people.
break it down to that ratio, it sounds like a lot.
It's a lot, yeah. And if you think that each one of those people, I think they say that we all associate with about 200 people in our lives pretty regularly. If you add up family, extended family, school, work, there's people who are really close to us who are affected by our loss, but there's also people who are more distant, and even celebrities. Like this week we lost both Betty White and Thich Nhat Hanh, two very, very beloved figures. And Meatloaf, for some people, was a big loss in the music world. And we feel affected by that, if only to think about our own mortality when those people pass. So there's personal grieving. And what therapists know anyway, is that Americans aren't great at grief. We don't have rituals of grief the way we used to. I'm mostly Irish, and so I know that 100 years ago, or even less than that, if somebody died in an Irish family, you'd have an Irish wake, and it would be 3 days of crying and drinking and talking and reminiscing and get-togethers that ironically, they used to be held in people's living rooms, which used to be called parlors. Right? And now they're called funeral parlors and living rooms because builders didn't want that room to be associated with death anymore.
Yeah.
Right? So yes, so we had those rituals, and now there's such an emphasis on productivity and work that people feel like they might get a day or two off if somebody they love passes away. At most, they might get a week or two, but really when you're grieving somebody very close to you, I think 2 years is kind of a minimum before people start feeling like themselves again and have integrated what that loss means into their life. And it can be actually quite a bit longer than that, depending. It might have been a beloved spouse or child, God forbid. These things are happening all over the world right now. And it's adding to our collective grief. But that's not the only kind of loss that COVID is bringing. COVID is bringing long-haul COVID. COVID is bringing lingering disease processes in people, like shortness of breath or fatigue, like extreme fatigue. Brain
Raised temperature, I've even heard.
Raised temperature? Oh, like chronically. Mm-hmm. That almost sounds like tuberculosis. That's interesting. Right. So these things, and we still don't even know what they all are because we're not on the other side of this yet. And scientists and doctors are doing a lot of studies, but we don't even know what they all are. So, as somebody myself, that I've had what they call chronic invisible illness, where I've had things like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue in my life, they are very hard, and you deal with a chronic sense of loss. Like, you look around at what your friends can do and then what you can do, and it's not the same, and it's a loss, and it's a kind of grief that has to be processed or even managed, because it's not like a one-time loss. It's chronic. So there's chronic losses associated with COVID. Then it has highlighted, as I think we're all aware, some very profound differences between groups of people in our society. And, roughly divided into red states and blue states. But I don't know if that's entirely fair. I think there are Democrats who don't like to mask and Republicans who do. So I'm not sure that's a very fair media division. It's easy. But they're the people who are more suspicious of big pharma and medical intervention, who no longer trust the system in a way that maybe their parents or grandparents did. And then there are those people who really put a lot of faith in the system, and maybe they have doctors or nurses in their families, and they really believe in what medicine has to offer. And those are some pretty big differences. And both sides feel threatened by the opposite side. And we talked about that in the last video, how when people feel threatened by another group, that leads to anger. But it also leads to grief. Like, you can't go home to Thanksgiving because Uncle George has a really different opinion than you do about something that's made you lose respect for him, and now it's out and you can't take it back, or you say something that he finds offensive, and there's all kinds of rifts happening in families right now that have been going on for a couple of years, and it's been brutal, been really, really hard. So there's levels of conflict that are overt, that used to be able to stay hidden, that maybe only manifested in the voting box by yourself, like, I don't agree with them, so I'm going to pull the lever differently. Now, if somebody has a very strong political disagreement, it might be like they won't wear a mask to your house, or you won't be invited by them for some reason if you do wear a mask. Like, and I'm not saying, I really want to say, I understand this is a cultural phenomena more than anything else. It's not my job to be moralistic about it, but it's my job to look at, what does this do to families, and how does this drive wedges between us in our attachment and our love for each other, which then results in this kind of unspoken grief. And how do you even grieve that? There's no funeral that you can hold for your uncle who didn't agree with you at Thanksgiving. That sounds trivial, but it's not trivial at all. It's really hard on people, and it's confusing to children also. They don't kind of know. They're like, if I have an opinion now, is I'm going to have the wrong one, people are going to hate me. Like, the stakes are so much higher right now than they've ever been for differences of opinion, and the pandemic has really driven the stakes on that way high. So that's another kind of loss we're all dealing with. Also, we're seeing that there's a significant part of the population who's fairly narcissistic. And I don't think some of us knew that before. Or we managed to suppress our knowledge about that, and we can't. So it's like, oh, we're here. We thought we were here in our evolution, but maybe we're like here, right? Maybe we're just coming out of babyhood. Like, we thought we were like adolescents, but now we're, yeah. So that's a loss. It's a loss of like where we thought we were as a human race, where we thought we were as a people, as a nation. Those have been some profound losses. And then there is this global element to it of what I talked in the most recent video too, is like, there is actually nowhere on the globe that's safe from the pandemic. Not even the South Pole. Somebody's got to fly supplies.
Not even remote Alaska.
Not even remote. Oh yeah. Yes, Brooke and I were in Alaska this summer, and I'm pretty sure I got COVID up there, and I hadn't thought about people coming to fish from all over the world. So those things happen, right? I mean, there's really nowhere to go to get away from this. There's no relief from it, really. And that also brings grief, because sometimes we just need a break, but we can't kind of get a break yet. And every time in the last 2 years, the pandemic has started to ease off and get better, and we've all been like, oh, there's the light at the end of the tunnel, then it's like Lucy with the football and Charlie Brown, like just like, oh, there's a new variant. Here comes Omicron. Oh my gosh, Omicron. Like, super contagious and not subject to the same rules as Delta. Also, fortunately, not making people as sick as Delta, but still plenty sick. Still people on ECMO, still people on respirators, still full ICUs all over the country. So there's been studies about how do human beings manage crises over time. And what researchers have found is that we are built to respond really well to crisis, but over a fairly short period of time. Like the natural phase of crisis resolution, that was an interesting slip. Crisis resolution is about 6 weeks. We naturally want to come to some resolution in about 42 to 44 days. But we can't. So we keep going through, and then we keep getting hit with these new crises. So we'll start to come out, and then we get hit with a new one. Or there's a crisis of a shortage of supply, or there's a crisis of rising mental health costs from kids not being in school. And it's not just one problem. It's like many, many, many problems. And the grief of us seeing how fragile our system really is and exposing the flaws in our system, which we'll talk about in the next video, how that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a painful thing that requires a grieving process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we're pulling the sheets off and exposing the things and on what to do.
Yeah, and a whole new, almost identity to be formed around who are we as a people in the face of what we now know.
And not just with COVID, though. It's what we now know with other aspects of life.
Yes. Yeah. How people really are behaving and how people do or do not consider each other in certain situations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The last thing that you would like to add?
But there's another part of this that I wanted to mention about how COVID is tied in with the environment in an interesting way, and is in some ways linked, like when I think as we get into looking historically at COVID, how it came to be, how it manifested, the effects it had, it coincides with a peak problem with climate change and environmental pollution. We're at peak in those areas. We know there's vast areas of the Pacific that have garbage in them that haven't been collected. We know that there's very erratic things happening with the weather. And we also know that COVID, in an interesting way, positively affected that. The weather, in any case, because the environment. Because when people didn't drive and fly so much, trees got better. But I think that there's almost a feeling of like the whole world's falling apart, not just COVID's almost like the last straw. It's like there were already these things sort of precariously balancing in our consciousness, and then COVID just kind of went on top of it, and now it's like it's very overwhelming because our sort of fragile level of denial that we had, if we had it, is collapsing, and it collapses into grief. Like, we can't just wave a magic wand and make COVID go away. We can't just wave a magic wand and make the environment okay. We have to acknowledge our deep sorrow at what is happening. We have to be able to feel that and release it to be able to move into action and solution. And we live in a culture that deeply discourages displays of grief and emotion and feminizes them and then denigrates them. So we got a whole lot of work ahead in terms of allowing ourselves to really feel our humanity and really be trusting that if we allow ourselves to have a good cry on a regular basis, or to take that time to just be with those very sad, profound feelings, that there will be a light at the end of that tunnel too. Because I think when people walk into that, it can feel very overwhelming and like it'll never end. But I promise you it will. And maybe I'll do a video soon about how to be with grief. You think that would be helpful, Brooke?
Sure.
Cool.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What would you like to say to your viewers?
I would like to say, if you like this video and the information that we've been providing you, please hit the like and subscribe button and share this with your friends. You never know who might really need to hear a little bit of wisdom around trauma and COVID. Thank you for your attention.